Everyone thinks a casserole is just food. They're wrong. A casserole is a contract. It is the most emotionally loaded rectangle in American life. And the people who bring one to your door are saying something they cannot say out loud. They are saying, I heard, I know, I cannot fix this, but I can feed you through it. For nearly a century, the 9-13 glass pan has carried more sorrow, more joy, and more unspoken affection across American thresholds than any greeting card ever printed. It has been the quiet witness at funerals and the loud centerpiece at church basements. It has shown up on front porches after babies were born and after diagnoses were delivered. And yet, somehow, we still talk about it like it is a recipe. It is not a recipe. It is a language. It is the way Americans learn to say, I love you, without ever having to use the words. And tonight, the story of how that language got written is going to pull on something in you that you didn't know was still there. To understand the emotional weight of the American casserole, you have to first understand the room it was born into. Picture a small farmhouse kitchen in 1934. The Depression is 4 years deep. Dust is on the windowsills. Meat is a Sunday luxury, if it comes at all. A woman stands at a white enamel stove, and in her hand is a new kind of can. Silver, heavy, with red and white labels. Inside it, a condensed soup that promised to do something her grandmother never imagined possible. It promised to turn a bowl of leftover rice, a handful of peas, and a scrap of chicken into a meal that looked like Sunday. That can was Campbell's Cream of Mushroom, introduced by the Campbell Soup Company in 1934, and tucked right there on the label was something no one had ever seen before. A recipe, not a soup recipe, a casserole recipe. The can itself was teaching her how to feed her family. That tiny instructional moment, printed in black ink on a tin label, rewired the American dinner table. It told the American housewife, you are not alone in this kitchen. There is a company in Camden, New Jersey, holding the other end of the spoon. And that quiet promise of help, of partnership, of somebody watching over her shoulder is the first thread in the emotional fabric of the casserole. But the can did not make the casserole. The community did, because around that same stove, in that same neighborhood, another ritual was quietly taking shape. A neighbor across the field had lost her husband, and the women of that township, without calling, without organizing, without even really speaking about it, began showing up at her back door with warm pans wrapped in tea towels. One brought a scalloped potato bake. One brought a noodle dish with ground beef and canned tomatoes. One brought a bread pudding, heavy with cinnamon and the last of the winter apples. They set the pans on the kitchen table, kissed the widow on the temple, and left. No one said much of anything. No one needed to. The pans said it for them. That moment, repeated in 10,000 American towns across the Depression, is where the emotional contract of the casserole was signed. The dish became shorthand for grief, for solidarity, for the quiet assurance that a family in crisis would not have to also think about dinner. You could not bring words. Words were thin, but you could bring a pan. A pan stood up. A pan warmed the oven. A pan made the house smell like somebody lived in it again. Here is something most people do not realize. The word casserole does not originally mean a dish of food. It means the vessel. The French word casserole, going back to the 1600s, described a saucepan, a deep-sided cooking pot. For centuries in Europe, a casserole was just a piece of cookware. It was Americans, specifically American women navigating hardship and abundance in the same century, who collapsed the word into the food itself. The container became the meal. The meal became the message. And that is the first clue that we are not talking about cooking. We are talking about something deeper, Because when a culture takes a piece of cookware and promotes it to a noun of feeling, something sacred has happened in that kitchen. The pan has become a pulpit. Now follow the thread forward to 1955. The war is over. The suburbs are rising. There is a woman in the Campbell's Test Kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, whose name almost nobody remembers and whose dish almost every American has tasted. Her name was Dorcas Riley. She was a home economist, trained at Drexel University, working in a small, fluorescent-lit room filled with electric ranges and clipboards and stacks of the same silver can. An editor from the Associated Press called Campbell's that year and asked for a simple holiday recipe, something a housewife could throw together with pantry staples. Dorcas and her colleague reached for cream of mushroom soup, a bag of frozen green beans, a splash of milk, a dash of soy sauce, black pepper, and a crown of crispy fried onions from a can. They baked it at 350 degrees until the top went golden, and the edges bubbled like small volcanoes around the rim. They called it green bean bake. The country, over the next 60 years, would call it green bean casserole, and it would sit on an estimated 20 to 30 million Thanksgiving tables every single year. Dorcas Riley did not know, in that small test kitchen, that she was writing the soundtrack to a half-century of family holidays. She thought she was answering a phone call, but the pan she slid into that oven was about to become the most beloved casserole in American history. And here is the smuggled fact most people miss. Dorcas Riley's original handwritten recipe card now sits in the National Inventors Hall of Fame, cataloged next to the light bulb and the telephone. A 3x5 card, a recipe for green beans, archived like a patent. Think about what that says about how seriously the culture came to take this dish. A home economist's casserole blueprint is preserved as American intellectual heritage. That is not a recipe, that is a relic. Pause for a second and breathe in what that Thanksgiving kitchen actually smells like. You know it. The warm, salty, sweet hit of fried onions toasting on top. The faint, earthy fog of mushroom cream bubbling through a lattice of slender green beans. The heat rolling off the oven door when Grandma cracks it open to check the top. The way the glass dish squeaks faintly against the wire rack when she pulls it out. The way her hands, wrapped in a folded dish towel, carry it through the doorway into the dining room, and every head at the table turns toward it without meaning to. Because the casserole, for most of the 20th century, has been the moment the family actually arrives at the table. Not the turkey, not the wine, the casserole, the dish. That says the meal has officially begun because somebody in the kitchen took the time to assemble something layered, something that had to be built in advance, something that had to wait its own patient hour in the oven while the rest of the meal swirled around it. The church basement is where the casserole went to worship. Somewhere between 1948 and the late 1960s, the American potluck grew into a full liturgical event. Wooden folding tables in a fellowship hall, paper tablecloths taped at the corners, a row of Corningware dishes and Pyrex pans lined up like an army, each with a strip of masking tape on the side scrawled with its owner's last name. Mrs. Hanson's tater tot hot dish, Mrs. Olson's tuna noodle, Mrs. Brecke's chicken and wild rice. The same dishes, week after week, decade after decade. And everyone knew whose was whose. Everyone knew that Mrs. Hanson's crust went a little too brown on purpose because that's how her mother had done it. Everyone knew Mrs. Olson hid a spoonful of sherry in hers, even though she'd never admit it out loud. The church basement casserole was not a meal. It was a social census. It told you who had shown up, who was feeling well enough to cook, who was new to the congregation, and who was quietly grieving. And that brings us to the most specific, most sacred version of the American casserole tradition, the Mormon Ward casserole. In the Latter-day Saints tradition, particularly across Utah, Idaho, and the Intermountain West, The ward casserole is practically a sacrament. When a family in a congregation called a ward experiences a death, a birth, an illness, a move, or any major life event, a Relief Society sister is assigned to organize what they simply call meals. For 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes longer, dinner shows up on that family's porch every single night. A pan of funeral potatoes, the legendary cheesy hash brown casserole crowned in crushed cornflakes and melted butter, a pan of chicken divan with broccoli and curry, a pan of 7-layer dinner, a pan of cheesy beef and rice. The rhythm is so reliable that Mormon children grow up understanding something that the rest of America has had to relearn the hard way, that when the worst thing happens, you will not go hungry. Because the ward will show up, the pan will show up, and the pan is the promise. There is a reason funeral potatoes are called funeral potatoes. They are not named for the feeling of grief. They are named for the fact that, in a ward community, that dish is the reliable first arrival after a death, before the obituary runs, before the flowers come, before the hearse is even scheduled. The casserole is already in the oven of someone you barely know. This is the emotional contract of the casserole laid bare. It is prepaid love. It is a form of social insurance that exists outside of policy, outside of money, outside of even friendship sometimes. You do not have to be close to someone to bring them a casserole. In fact, the casserole travels best between people who are not close, because the dish itself does the emotional work. The cook does not have to find the right words at the door. The cook does not have to sit in the living room and make conversation with a grieving widow. The cook just hands over the pan, and inside the pan is every word the cook does not know how to say. I am sorry. I am here. I was thinking about you. I do not know what to do, but I can feed you tonight. Shift gears for a moment and consider the geography of it, because casseroles are not distributed evenly across America. They cluster. They have territories. There is a broad band through the upper Midwest, stretching from Minnesota through Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa, where the casserole is not called a casserole at all. It is called a hot dish, and the hot dish in that country is not just a dish, it is an identity. A Minnesotan can tell you whether a tot hot dish is properly constructed within the first 2 bites. Is there cream of mushroom soup? Is there ground beef browned with onion? Are the tots laid in neat geometric rows across the top, crispy and golden, or are they thrown on in chaos? Is there a layer of green beans or corn hidden beneath? Every choice is a tell. Every hot dish carries the fingerprint of a family. You cannot serve a Lutheran funeral supper in rural Minnesota without a hot dish. It would be like showing up to a wedding without rings. The hot dish is the cultural password, and its very name, hot dish, so plain, so unpretentious, so almost defiantly humble, tells you everything about the emotional register of that region. Nothing fancy, nothing showy, just something warm in a pan, handed across a kitchen counter between 2 people who would rather express themselves through butter than through words. Meanwhile, down south, the casserole wears a different accent. It becomes a chicken and rice bake with paprika and pimientos. It becomes squash casserole with Ritz cracker topping and butter. It becomes sweet potato casserole with brown sugar and pecans, technically a side, but emotionally a love letter. In the South, the casserole leans into richness, butter, cream, crunch on top, and a sweetness that the northern dishes avoid. But the function is identical. When somebody in a Baptist church in Alabama has a baby, that woman is getting at least 4 casseroles on her doorstep within the week. It is the same contract, spoken in a drawl. Let us pause on the pan itself, because the pan matters. The 9 by 13 glass Pyrex dish, First introduced by Corning in 1915 as heat-resistant borosilicate glass, became the default American casserole vessel somewhere around the late 1940s. And it is worth asking why. The answer is partly practical. Roughly 2.5 quarts of capacity, it feeds between 8 and 12 people. That is the exact size of an extended family or a small potluck contribution. But the deeper answer is emotional. The 9X13 Pyrex is transparent. You can see the layers, you can see the care. You can see the bubbling cheese and the browning edges before you even lift the lid. The pan itself performs the love, and because Pyrex is durable, it is also returnable. The pan goes out with food, comes back washed, and often comes back with a thank you note folded inside. There is a saying passed quietly through church circles that you should never send a casserole in a pan you cannot afford to lose, because sometimes the pan does not come back. Seasoned casserole bringers know to mark their initials on the bottom with a permanent marker, a small Sharpied code, so that somewhere down the road of kitchens and hands, the pan might find its way home. Now take a breath and imagine the choreography of a meal train. You have probably seen one, even if you did not know it had a name. In 2010, a small American company called Meal Train launched a website that formalized what church ladies had been doing by hand for a century. A family experiences a crisis. A coordinator sets up an online calendar. Friends, co-workers, neighbors sign up for specific nights, the AIZ, app notes, dietary restrictions, allergies, favorite dishes, and drop-off preferences. And suddenly, a rural Lutheran tradition from 1955 has become a digital app used by millions of Americans from every faith and no faith at all. The meal train did not invent the casserole handoff. It just took the invisible infrastructure that had been running through American kitchens for 100 years and gave it a URL. What changed was not the emotion. What changed was that the same love could now cross zip codes. A college roommate in Seattle could sign up to send a casserole to a friend in Nashville through a local delivery service. The emotional contract went digital, but the pan at the center stayed the same. Here is a thought that might stop you cold. The casserole is one of the very few American foods that is almost never ordered in a restaurant. Think about that. You cannot really buy a casserole. Oh, sure, you can find frozen ones in a grocery store, and some cafeterias and diners serve something approximating one. But the casserole as a cultural object does not live in the commercial marketplace. It lives almost exclusively in the home kitchen, traveling between homes. It is one of the last foods in American life that resists monetization. You do not pay for a casserole. You receive one. And when you receive one, you are accepting a small, invisible, unpriced social debt. Someday, years from now, the person who brought you that pan of baked ziti may have a death in her family, and you will stand up from the couch, drive to the grocery store, and start browning hamburger for her. That is not a recipe. That is a civilization. Let us move into the 1960s because something crucial happened in that decade that deepened the casserole's emotional role. In 1968, the Campbell Soup Company published the Cooking with Soup Cookbook, a soft-covered, spiral-bound volume that sold in the millions. Inside were hundreds of casserole recipes, all based on various condensed soups: cream of chicken, cream of celery, cream of mushroom, tomato, golden mushroom. Each page showed a smiling family around a glowing table, and the subliminal message was steady and unmistakable. You, the American housewife, can hold this household together with nothing but a can and a pan, and millions of women suddenly juggling part-time jobs, Tupperware parties, school board meetings, and 3 to 5 children reached gratefully for that promise. The casserole became, in that decade, the architecture of female competence. It was the dish that told the world, I have my life together, even when the house was chaos. Assembled in the morning, stashed in the fridge, baked in the evening. A casserole did not require a woman's constant attention. It let her sit down for 10 minutes. It let her answer the phone. It let her breathe. And in letting her breathe, it earned a loyalty that is still burning in American kitchens 60 years later. You can taste that era in the dishes that survived. King Ranch chicken, spread through church cookbooks in the late 1950s, layering corn tortillas with chicken, rotel tomatoes, and cream of mushroom. Chicken tetrazzini, a creamy pasta and mushroom casserole named for an opera singer. Johnny Marzetti, a Midwest ground beef and pasta bake invented in Columbus, Ohio. Each dish carries a decade, a kitchen, a woman, a family encoded into its layers. Now pay attention to the quiet psychology of the one-dish meal, because this is where the casserole's magic really lives. A plate with separate foods is a plate of choices. Meat here, starch there, vegetable to the side. You can pick and choose. You can refuse the peas. You can skip the rice. But a casserole is integrated. Every bite includes every element. You cannot pick the chicken out of a chicken and rice bake without mangling the whole dish. The cook has made the decisions for you. The cook has said, "This is what you need tonight. Eat this. Trust me." And there is something profoundly comforting about surrendering that decision, especially in the middle of grief, exhaustion, or illness. When you are falling apart, the last thing you want is a plate of choices. You want somebody else's kindness, pre-assembled, pre-baked, pre-decided, warm, and waiting on the counter. That is what the casserole delivers. It delivers the gift of not having to think. It delivers rest in the form of food. There is something else worth noticing. The casserole is inherently generous. You cannot make a casserole for one person. The pan is too big. The quantity is too large. To make a casserole is to assume company, to assume sharing, to assume that more than one mouth will be involved. Even a woman cooking a casserole for herself and her husband on a Tuesday night in Omaha is implicitly planning for leftovers, for tomorrow, for a lunch shared at a coworker's desk. The casserole resists individualism by design. It is a dish that cannot be selfish, and in an American culture that has grown increasingly private, increasingly single-serving, increasingly delivered in brown paper bags at front doors, the casserole stands as a small, stubborn insistence that food is supposed to be passed around. The shift came slowly and then quickly. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, the American casserole began a slow retreat from the center of the family table. Dual-income households left less time for the layered, hour-long bake. The rise of Whole Foods, of farmers' markets, of a new food media championing fresh, seasonal, unprocessed ingredients cast the cream of mushroom casserole as a kind of embarrassing relative. Food Network hosts rolled their eyes at condensed soup. Magazines started running features on how to elevate the casserole, how to make it sophisticated, how to rescue it from its own reputation. And something quiet and sad happened in the process. The emotional weight of the dish, the 200 years of grief meals and potluck rhythms and ward baskets, got decoupled from the recipe. Suddenly, the green bean casserole was just an outdated side. Suddenly, the tuna noodle was a joke on a sitcom. The dish that had carried American families through the Depression, through the war, through the suburbs, through the Mormon pew, through the Lutheran Fellowship Hall, was being quietly sidelined in favor of sheet pan dinners and one-pot Instagram recipes. But the emotional contract never actually died. It just went underground for a while, and in the last 10 to 15 years, something unmistakable has started to happen. The casserole is coming home, not as a retro joke, not as a wink at grandma, as itself. Millennial and Gen Z cooks raised on takeout and meal kits are rediscovering the pan. Funeral potatoes are showing up in glossy food. magazines. Chicken and rice bake is trending on TikTok. The meal train, formalized online, has made casserole giving visible to a generation that might have otherwise forgotten the ritual existed. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, and Americans found themselves cooking more at home than they had in 40 years, the casserole quietly walked back into the kitchen as if it had never left. Because when the world got hard, people remembered. They remembered the pan. They remembered that food, layered and baked and shared, is one of the oldest forms of love in the human playbook, and that is the echo of the casserole today. Somewhere tonight, in a kitchen in Iowa, a woman is assembling a tater-tot hot dish for a neighbor whose husband just started chemotherapy. Somewhere tonight, in a church in Utah, a Relief Society sister is pulling funeral potatoes out of a Pyrex dish she has owned for 34 years. Somewhere tonight, in a city apartment in Brooklyn, a young man is following his grandmother's handwritten recipe card for King Ranch chicken, and the kitchen smells like his childhood, and he doesn't know why he's crying. The casserole has not gone anywhere. It has simply kept doing its job quietly, reliably, generation after generation, while the rest of the food world rearranged itself around it. A casserole is not a recipe. It has never been a recipe. It is a promise in a pan, warm from the oven, slid across a kitchen counter into the hands of somebody who needs it. It is the oldest, simplest, most American way of saying I love you without ever opening your mouth. Now here is what I want you to do. I want you to think about your own family. I want you to think about the casserole that was always there, on the Thanksgiving table, or the funeral buffet, or the Sunday after church. I want you to think about whose hands made it. Was it your grandmother, your aunt, your mother, the neighbor? From across the street, who always showed up on the worst days? What did that dish taste like? What Pyrex pan did it come in? Did it have a signature topping? A signature smell? A signature way of being set down on the table? Because every family in this country has one. Every family has a casserole that is less about the food and more about the hands. I want you to go down into the comments and tell me about yours. Tell me the name of the dish. Tell me who made it. Tell me what it meant. Because when you share that story, you are not just posting a recipe. You are lighting a small candle in somebody else's memory. You are reminding another viewer of the aunt they lost, the mother they miss, the grandmother whose handwriting was on the back of a stained index card in a tin box. This channel is a kitchen. Pull up a chair. Tell us what was in your family's pan. And if this story warmed you tonight, the way a casserole is supposed to warm a house, hit that like button, subscribe, and come back next time. Because there are still 1,000 more American stories baking in ovens out there, and we are just getting started.